Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Friends of the Dar, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Tonight's speaker is special. Not only is she an eminent scholar, a published author, an administrator, an educator, a leader in the arts, a strong supporter of scholars in difficult circumstances, and a defender of cultural heritage, but she is the Vice Chancellor of New York University in Abu Dhabi, a relatively new university in a country that she now considers home. She has been extremely forward-looking in nurturing the university there, which, unlike other universities, did not close down during the pandemic. This presented many challenges that she dealt with creatively, supporting taking practical, sound scientific measures to protect the staff and student body from infection while instituting measures like online learning. Under her leadership, the university has thrived. Dr. Westerman was selected for her position at the university after a 10-month search by Abu Dhabi, as she considers the goals of the founders of the university to be in line with those of her own. This evening, she will be delivering a lecture entitled, What is cultural protection today, and why does it matter? Which promises to consider a timely situation that concerns all of us, whether in Kuwait or internationally. Now, she posed a very important question, and I want to pose another. What does it matter that you had to play with your telephones during the lecture? I don't think it does. So please turn off your mobile phones and let's welcome Dr. Westmeyer.
Thank you so much, Mr. Badr, for the very kind and very special introduction, really personally delivered. Your Highnesses, distinguished guests, and all friends of Dar al-Athar, it's really such an honor to be here. I'm really delighted to be back in your beautiful city. And I'm very grateful, especially to Director General Sheikh Hassa, for inviting me to speak at the Dar, which offers truly one of the most distinguished and longest running lecture series of such high quality in the wide region. It is really a delight to be back in Kuwait, a city that has such a long and layered cultural history itself, from ancient maritime traditions to heights of Islamic art in this very building, and from its modern art and architecture, which is so distinguished, to the most recent cultural initiatives of this country and of this very institution. And we'll talk more about those in a minute. Indeed, the cultural history of Kuwait has been much on our minds at NYU Abu Dhabi, my home institution, this fall, because we are right now having a wonderful exhibition there called Khalij Modern, on pioneer modern artists in the Gulf. And you see here the entrance gallery to it. Among the earliest pioneers of modern art in the Gulf are several prominent Kuwaiti artists, as you can see in this very first room, including at the right, here, the very first work you see in the show, a work by Mojib al-Dosari, whose portrait of Tawfiq Al-Jara we were very privileged to have on loan. It's really the first thing you see. And Mojib was a high school student in the late 30s and 40s at Al-Mubarakiyah School, which was at the time one of the very first in the Gulf to offer art classes as part of the curriculum. And he participated in its very first exhibition in 1943, and later was supported by the state of Kuwait to study in Egypt and England. Sadly, all but I believe 11 of his works were lost, mostly in the First Gulf War. And we have other wonderful Kuwaiti artists in the show. I'll just show you two more, but there are more. Another native son, Ibrahim Ismail, stars in the show with these three paintings, including one of our favorites of all, this marvelous picture building of ships from 1966, which we love so much that we made it the iconic image to advertise the show far and wide. And it is the most popular exhibition the gallery has had in its 8 years of existence. And I think that Ibrahim's picture is wonderful for this talk because it shows you that cultural heritage is dynamic, not static or frozen in time. It can be both ancient, like the shipbuilding technique that this picture is about in some ways, and modern at the same time in this striking modernist painting. Kuwaiti women also really stand out, including here Munir al-Qazi, an artist who was born in India, who started working in Kuwait from the 1950s on, and has painted such striking works of family and mothers, among other topics. Here, a wonderful one that is today in the Barjil Foundation in Sharjah. And I think these lovely paintings from Kuwait offer a way into my topic, which is the protection of cultural heritage and why we should care about it. Kuwait, which saw such grievous destruction of cultural heritage and looting of art in the war, is of course a resonant place for this topic, which is why I thought of it. This Mughal dagger, which I saw for the first time today, was from the Al-Saba collection, was stolen and only fortuitously recovered. But I have another reason for choosing the topic of cultural heritage here today. My Arabic is certainly not as strong as it should be, but I do understand that al-Athar means the things that remain in many different ways, from the sayings and deeds of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, to the wide range of things that we, as human beings, cherish so much that we want to keep them. We want to keep them as individuals, in our families, but we want to keep them collectively, as peoples, as nations, as humans. And this impulse to retain things that remain, to retain things that are meaningful to us, not just because they are useful, like a bowl or a credit card or an iPhone, but we want to keep them because they help anchor us psychologically as humans in our communities, in our histories, and in our own lives. And that impulse to retain such things that are not just utilitarian or of monetary value is fundamentally human, I would say, and it is of very, very long duration in human history. And that impulse drives the protection and preservation of cultural heritage, which is also an old tradition. And so I thought that at the Dar al-Athar, the house of the things that remain, it would be appropriate to speak here to what is for me indeed a very enduring commitment, which is to the understanding of the things that are so cherished that they remain, to cultural heritage and to its preservation. To give you a bit of a roadmap, my talk has 3 parts. First, I will ask that question of what cultural heritage is, how we might define it, and why it is under heightened threat. And next, I will try to map the growing field, it is a growing field happily, dedicated to its protection, with a focus on one of the new heritage protection programs in which this country, Kuwait, plays a major role. And then I will close with the shortest part, a very brief reflection on why we have a responsibility to protect cultural heritage, our own, but also very much the cultural heritage of others. And then I hope we'll have a chance to engage. I'm really interested in your feedback, questions and comments. So we'll start with that first part. What is cultural heritage and why is it under threat? Well, I think we know that in our century, the intentional destruction of cultural heritage has become a shockingly familiar topic of news reports and of social media clickbait. And in part, this familiarity with this kind of wanton destruction is the result from an actual increase in attacks on religious buildings from the ancient past to today. Attacks also on works of art from different cultures, like the Bamiyan Buddhas, and attacks on museums and works of art and cultural heritage sites. And these attacks, in many of the slides I've shown you, in all the slides I've shown you, are weaponized in all sorts of international and domestic conflicts. These conflicts are not all the same at all. It's just a strategy that people have learned to use. And as political scientists have shown, after the relative geopolitical stability of the Cold War came to an end late in the 20th century, since then we have entered an era of long-lasting regional and civil wars, or rather, I find them so uncivil that I call them domestic wars, long-lasting regional and domestic wars that now appear almost pandemic. It seems to be very hard to bring any such conflicts to an end. Nevertheless, even though we see so many of these attacks these days, attacks on cultural heritage are not new. They're almost as old as cultural heritage itself. And you could say that in part our heightened awareness of these attacks is due to the rise of social media and the internet, phenomena that have enabled instant documentation of acts of aggression against heritage. Documentation by the perpetrators themselves. They like it that you see these things. Documentation by victims appealing for help, and also by observers like ourselves and journalists who need to document these things. And indeed, that almost escalates these events sometimes. For example, this kind of an attack on the shrine of Yunus, the tomb of Jonah in English, many of these attacks indeed appear made for Twitter and CNN. And while much of the destruction can be laid at the door of extremist groups like the Taliban and Daesh, there is really a wide range of perpetrators and victims. And some of the devastation is aimed at communities more than at a specific religion. It's sort of a strategy of war. And honestly, for any of these that I've shown you, although some of them are especially spectacular, I can show you other attacks on Christian churches, on heritage sites in Ethiopia, in Myanmar. I mean, it really is become, and of course on synagogues, on any number of sites that offend some group or another. Now, I believe that this is not what most people want. There is, I haven't polled all of humanity about this, needless to say, but I believe that the vast majority of human beings do not like to see works of human creativity and culture accomplishment that are very old or very new to be destroyed in this way. Most people, I really believe, if you would ask them, would probably be horrified by pictures like the ones I've shown you and agree that cultural heritage is worth protecting. But then when you start thinking about it and talking with people, as I often do in seminars and classes and groups like this, the question often arises, what cultural heritage is worth protecting? Or what is worth more protecting than other cultural heritage? Or in other words, what counts as cultural heritage? And it turns out then that many people don't agree entirely on the answers in any given setting or country. And I think it's fair to think, it's a human impulse to think of your own cultural heritage, of your country, your people, your language, your religion, whatever your affinities may be, that you consider that heritage as especially worth protecting. And it is also probably pretty well known that the heritage that is dear to one group may be considered inappropriate, worthless, or even taboo by others. That's the challenge with cultural heritage. It's both specific and potentially universal. And while many people, including, I believe, everyone in this wonderful audience, value the diversity of human cultural accomplishments and love to visit museums and art centers and celebrate that variety in festivals and any places where culture can be celebrated, other people, it's true, may find that diversity of culture frightening or even offensive, not worthy of existence. And that's when you get attacks. So the question then becomes, can we come, at least for now in this discussion, to a shared understanding of what cultural heritage is and who owns it and who has a stake in it? What is worth protecting and preserving, and for whose benefit do we do it? Most societies struggle with the idea that I believe, but not everyone does, the idea that culture is truly universal. That the culture of one nation, it doesn't mean that all the culture is the same, but the idea of culture is universal. And this is that idea that the culture of one nation or one group is as valid as that of another half a globe away. You may not like it, but it has a right of existence, or you should know about it. Even that is a hard thing to think about, because some cultures truly, you could say, well, is Nazi culture worth preserving? Does it count as culture? Very interesting question. But positive culture as a positive source for societies and for groups, I do believe that that idea indeed can be universal. And the idea that culture is universal has its origins in the idea that all human beings have natural rights as human beings and as part of societies or groups. And now these ideas that humans have natural human rights and that there is such a thing as universal culture, they are connected in a way. And they were developed during the European Enlightenment, essentially in their sort of legal and philosophical articulation in the Enlightenment of the 18th century. And that's, of course, we don't have to dwell on this, but that's a development that led to earth-shaking developments, such as the French Revolution and, more perniciously, European imperialism. The Enlightenment does not have a universally good outcomes, but it has this very interesting theory of natural human rights and the universality of culture. I think today it's fair to say, and our students at MU Abu Dhabi, who come from 120 countries, tell me this all the time, today many former colonial nations reject this Western idea of cultural universality, and I find that understandable. And I find that rejection understandable, not least because the idea that culture is universal, historically Europeans favored particular forms of culture as universal, or as the most universal, like Greek and Roman architecture or sculpture or European painting, rather than all these other kinds of culture that are only in theory or universal. So there was always kind of a hierarchy of what was a little bit more universal than other culture. Nevertheless, I think that in itself, the idea that human beings share a universal interest in culture doesn't have to be pernicious. It doesn't have to be bad. All humans and societies make culture in many different forms, from visual art and music to dance and poetry, from social rituals and cuisine to buildings and religious rites and so forth. Music, of course. And this reality that all humans, as far as we can tell, make culture of some form is really a powerful source of connection among us, across massive spans of time and geography sometimes. Let me go far in time to show this to you. We know, for example, we know now that the oldest abstract cave painting, which you see on the left, is more than 70,000 years old, way before writing was developed or mathematics. And it was found a few years ago only in a cave in South Africa. And then the first images that are not abstract, but are images of human hands stenciled onto the cave wall there, and of animals. They go back some 40,000 years, older than we ever knew. These in Sulawesi, in Indonesia. So every culture is really very old and everywhere. And you'd have to think that besides painting, which I happen to love because I'm a scholar of painting, but you have to imagine that if people were capable of doing this, cultural forms like ritual gatherings, dance, chanting, and so forth must have similar longevity. So we all share some form of culture. But when then does culture become heritage? Heritage from the word inheritance, inheriting, passed down the generations, passed down through families, through tribes, through religions, or through states. I would frame cultural heritage as follows. This is the theory of it that I have developed over time of how to think about it. Over time, human beings have dealt with all that culture they've produced, objects and rituals and social forms, in two different ways. This is very simplistic. Some of them they discard as trash, garbage, as what is no longer needed, what doesn't need to remain. Other objects and social forms and aesthetic forms, performances, others, they cherish and they preserve it, and it becomes heritage. They pass it down because they preserve it. It is what is to be cherished in the present and to be kept for the future and the people we imagine coming after us. The al-Athar, the things that remain. But of course, what is heritage at any one time is also subject to change, because sometimes people throw things out much later that were passed down to them, or decide they no longer need it, or no longer of our time. They may decide to keep them, they may decide to discard them, they may put them in a museum, they may say, "Khalas, enough." So what is heritage is also subject to change, it's dynamic. And at any one moment, one human being's trash may become another one's treasure. One culture's detritus, another's beloved heritage. And what's so interesting is that much contemporary art engages with that dynamic ambiguity about what we dismiss, what we choose to remember, what we wish to value. And I think that is one reason that so many artists today make art from what others consider stuff that we might as well throw out, what others consider garbage. Here's a nice example from the same exhibition today. Hassan Sharif, pioneer of contemporary art in the UAE. And works like this, these wonderful arrangements of leftover pieces of jute, cloth and rope that we might have tossed away in the garbage. He makes such pretty works of them, beautiful works. And of course, they're partly about recycling works like this, but the forms that they take also suggest that the artist notices patterns and things of value that other humans may overlook, things that connect us, like little pieces of rope. And I think this artist, Hassan Sharif, who died a few years ago, often turned things that were left behind into really striking works of art. So cultural heritage then, as I have defined it now, is simultaneously of the past and of the present. Its objects, these very old objects, often give us access to the mental sets, the mental dispositions of people who had bodies like ours, but in very different times and places and circumstances. It's a way of gaining access to other human beings from far away and long ago, or just from another place. And these times and these places would be very hard to imagine if we did not have them. Thinking about people from the past on any place if you never had seen any object that they had created or heard any of their music or read any of their stories or heard them. It would be so abstract. Cultural heritage institutions, like this very one, they gather, they study, they display and they transmit these things to give us access to the experiences of other individuals and other cultures. And people in the present, like us, can then use these things to think with, use these things that remain to think about our societies, our connections to each other, our differences from each other, even our conflicts. They can help us think about our understandings of the earthly world or the divine, or how one might think about that. And some, like Hassan Sharif, use them to make new art that we can then think of and that become heritage in themselves. And I think there is great wonder in such moments of human connection that we can feel confronted with the cultural heritage of others across space and time, whether it's our own cultural heritage or from another culture. There's wonder in that, and I think there is also hope. There's hope in the recognition that these works can prompt in us, recognition that are things that unite us as people, even as they also differentiate us, and that differentiation can be beautiful and interesting. So, to wrap up this little section, I take cultural heritage to be the material record of our shared humanity across time and space. And therefore, I take cultural heritage protection to be the keeping and the institutional cherishing of that record. This record needs to be available to us so we can deal with unresolved issues in our past, so we can remember moments of hardship and resilience, of beauty and of hope, and so we can imagine a shared future together. So part 2, how can we protect it then, if we can more or less agree on what I've just said? I will take us into the case of Aleph by way of, through first a little bit of an introduction of how to think about this ecosystem that can protect cultural heritage. So if culture is a special human resource, that means that its rich diversity is every human being's patrimony, and therefore preserving it is also everyone's responsibility. Protecting heritage, of course, can seem exhausting and almost impossible. There's so much of it. And it is indeed a never-ending task of vigilance that requires governments, international and local NGOs, universities like my own, cultural heritage institutions like this one, and communities like this one to pull together. Because there are major forces in our world putting cultural heritage at greater risk than ever. I've already mentioned some, but there are more. Regional and domestic warfare, sectarian conflicts driven by intolerance and extremism, urban development and rural depletion, the oceanic and atmospheric forces that have been unleashed by our carbon emissions. Even rampant inequality, which we see around the world, is a threat to cultural heritage too. For example, it encourages looting, which is often pursued by people who have no other way of gaining access to resources. It leads to informal inhabitation of archaeological and cultural sites, as we've seen in Petra and other sites. That doesn't always have to be bad, by the way, but I'm just mentioning the idea that lack of resources to basic human, for the service of basic human needs will make people do desperate things that affect heritage too. Now, increasingly, here's the good news, international players, from museum directors and NGO executives to UNESCO and heads of state and ministers of culture, are stepping up to stress the importance of solidarity across borders to tackle a challenge that is as complicated as the protection of global cultural heritage. The task seems enormous and too complicated. It is too complicated for any one organization or player to handle alone. and in a more hopeful moment, it was thought that UNESCO could do it, but even UNESCO from the earliest days needed other partners to do the work. To show you this, I'm going to just briefly map the field of cultural heritage preservation to begin to see how we can best act together. And I'll just show you a diagram that I have been evolving over the years to help me see pathways to do better as a society. So cultural heritage protection is sort of what's mapped here in a very somewhat simplistic way, but these are sort of the players you can think about. So cultural heritage protection exists to sustain this, all this stuff in cultural heritage in the center. In that big dark purple oval, it is the stuff that survives over time, the things that remain, that I've just talked about. And directly above is all of us on Earth, individual human beings who make, destroy, lose, and preserve things. That's us. We're not perfect. And together, we coalesce into the very diverse communities that make up larger bodies like states and also diasporic groups and other communities. So those kind of brighter purple or dark violet bubbles represent kind of large formations and large groups of people who make culture. And on that scale of those three big ovals of the globe and of countries, it's really very hard for the cultural heritage protection community to intervene. We are, in the end, fairly small compared to these other forces we're fighting. But if you look at these lighter colored ovals here that represent cultural heritage protection entities, you will see a rich web of activities related to documenting, teaching, studying, and preserving cultural heritage. Documentation and research is huge. It's critically important to know where things are, what the state of them is, why and how they mean things to people, what their history is. So documentation and research is critical. It seems so basic, but there is not enough of it ever. And besides that, of course, documentation and research are themselves a form of preservation. And they create a basis for direct interventions in any area where it's needed. And through documentation and also through the work of conservators and restoration experts, we can be better prepared to protect cultural heritage. We can be prepared to prevent cultural heritage in times of war and in times of peace. It never lets up. And then, of course, none of this can happen without good systems of training and education for cultural heritage preservation experts, such as professionals like conservators, educators, administrators, and curators, photographers, mappers, social media people. And crucially, then, we also need, over here, being trained and educated, the next generation of students who are willing to be taught. The future of cultural heritage, in the end, is also in their hands, and it is in their interest. So in these lightest violet bubbles, these four to the left, the cultural heritage community can indeed do a lot. It can enact more protection, for example, than in a raging armed conflict. For that, they need the help of states. Now, who get to say how cultural heritage should be protected and who need to be at the preservation table? This is kind of dense. You can look at it on YouTube later, and we'll publish it too. But what this is a slide where I try to map a diagram of the ecosystem of institutions and forces that exist and are needed if we're going to have protect cultural heritage at all. Some of them are very old, some of them are newer. And what's interesting that any of these forces, while they're important to be able to protect, they can also pose obstacles, whether by apathy, lack of transparency, negligence, or even active countervailing actions that can harm culture. For example, I've put here market forces, commercial forces. Those are important. Markets help preserve, but they can also do damage, for example, to cultural heritage if they take apart manuscripts to sell little pieces of them to different places and so forth. So each of these boxes you should also think of as quite porous. They overlap with each other, but in the interest of clarity, I've outlined them. And just briefly I can say what you see here. The two columns in the middle, closer to each other, they encompass all the owners and stewards of cultural heritage. They're vital because they preserve and they can bring knowledge about it, as this organization here does, to the public. Or they can decide not to do it if they want to throw up an obstacle, as libraries sometimes historically did. The most obvious places of owners are, of course, museums, libraries, and archives, but there are lots of other entities that own and govern heritage, not even including individuals. Religious foundations, memorial parks, historical districts, cultural landscapes, digital repositories, very importantly, and even social media with its curated aggregations of cultural material. Everyone's a curator these days on Instagram. Market forces are pronounced, I mentioned them already. Collectors and private conservators play an important role, and so do auction houses, dealers, big tech, gaming, and AI. We have to make sure again that they work for good rather than sometimes get in the way of sound preservation practice. And all these cultural heritage organizations and owners in the middle, these two columns, stand in varying relations to the entities in the columns at the left and at the right. On the left, I think it's pretty easy to see, are the governmental and intergovernmental entities that set policy for cultural heritage or that fund and adjudicate it. Here are funders, here is the law. And also there are the NGOs that resource, that champion and enact preservation. NGOs at any scales are critical to the ecosystem. And meanwhile on the right, we have these knowledge institutions that generate cultural heritage data and educate and train professionals to take care of it, as well as the institutes and societies that advance the theory and the discourse of heritage protection and offer a lot of transmission type activities. And it goes on because it also changes, and this big etc. here at the bottom is important because new players that could be valuable to cultural heritage protection emerge all the time. Witness, of course, the metaverse. So I hope that these diagrams show you the complexity of the ecosystem. And I would say that the more that these forces can be lined up to work together in any one place to facilitate research, do conservation and restoration work, and to staff and train the cultural heritage sector, the more likely we are to salvage the cultural matter that matters to people. And the more forums we have, like this one, to bring people together from different positions in the system, across these boxes and columns, and especially from the communities whose cultures are at risk, the more likely we are to keep the destructive forces of time and humanity itself at bay. Now, as I've said, there is new resolve in the international community to protect culture. It's been notable the last 15 years. And the heightened visibility of threats to heritage that comes from social media has brought many new players into this collective task, from governments and international NGOs to universities, community organizations, and social media influencers. And I will present just one powerful example of what the international community can actually accomplish, and fast, if we put our minds to it and our money to it together. And that is the case of Aleph. In 2016, the highly visible attacks by Daesh on ancient structures and religious sites like the temples at Palmyra and the Tomb of Yunus jolted the international community into action, led by France and the UAE. In December of that year, the leaders of those countries convened counterparts from more than 40 other states and a whole bunch of other organizations, including UNESCO, NGOs, museums, and funders in Abu Dhabi, to launch the idea of a rapid response fund for the protection of heritage, specifically in active conflict zones. Only 3 months later in Paris, several governments and private funders created the Alliance for the Protection of Cultural Heritage in Conflict Areas, called ALIPH for short. It's the French acronym. Kuwait, I'm happy to say, participated from the very beginning, and Emir Sheikh Sabah al-Ahmad al-Jabr al-Sabah was there. He came to Abu Dhabi to announce his intent to participate on behalf of the country. The late Emir did. It was very moving to see so many leaders step up. So what is ALIPH? Well, ALIPH was created to focus on heritage protection in conflict areas, and not to do that alone, but to complement and accelerate the work of existing cultural heritage organizations. The response was just too slow and too powerless to all these attacks we've been seeing. And ALIPH did not mean they wanted to go it alone. ALIPH wants to go together, but it wants to go faster, and therefore its governing principle from the beginning was action, action, action. Action in terms of speed, actual resources, and concrete activities. It is its governing principle. And I'm happy to say that just 5 years later, ALIPH is a well-established partnership of governments and private funders, public-private partnership on the model of the Global Health Fund that fights the great pandemics. I was very fortunate to be working for the Mellon Foundation at the time and to participate on behalf of the Mellon Foundation and commit our funding to it as a private organization. I continue to serve on its board today. Dar al-Athar's Director General, Sheikh Hassa, was a founding member of our board on behalf of the state of Kuwait, and she served with great distinction. And Sheikh Hassa, we miss you. But you are very busy. A little bit more on how we actually work. How is ALIPH constituted? To protect heritage, to serve peace, to build peace. As you can see, we are a private foundation and an international organization based in Geneva. We are truly public-private. You see the countries, the founding countries. By now we are 12 countries. If you include the European Union, it's a lot more countries than that. And we have private donors and foundations involved. We raised capital by now over 170 million. The first call was 80 million. We just raised another 90 million from the donors, new ones coming in. We bring together expertise, and we work closely with UNESCO, which holds a seat on our board as well. And we work with a great network of 200 international experts and have an extremely high-powered scientific committee of heritage professionals from around the world who've done this kind of work for years. And then we work with partners, dozens of partners on the ground. Because this is what we actually do. We don't do the work ourselves, so to speak. We finance and we bring resources, human resources, to projects on the ground. We work on concrete projects in the field, and I can say that our real value, I think, is that we can unlock resources faster because we have a very nimble system of response with a small but mighty secretariat that also has a good social media presence in Geneva. So we unlock these funds to help preserve heritage that is already damaged, or to protect it against looming harm. Often just shoring up with sandbags, a museum will protect it from shelling. And importantly, the grants and the partnerships that we look at, we always look at the people behind it. There are always people behind cultural heritage. And so a lot of it is focused, the support is focused on what we can do with local people to train them, to help them do better by their heritage, but also gain jobs and skills and even develop tourism. So we work to rebuild heritage sites and conservation practices after conflict as much as prevent. and we thereby foster sustainable economic development and even forms of reconciliation. This is where we've been working in these 5 years that we've been at it, all over the world. To date, more than 180 projects have been supported at many different scales in more than 30 countries. Let's quickly look at a few examples. I can talk about any of them. Iraq, of course, has always been much on our mind. The Mosul Museum, whose destruction I showed you in the photographs, we've been working there both on the collections and on the buildings itself. And you can see these are all the partners. This is the Heritage Authority of Iraq, the Smithsonian, the Louvre, World Monuments Fund, and people on the ground. It's ongoing and painstaking work. And here the building itself still needs to be fully restored, and we are working on that as well. Our ALIF is funding that as well. Of course, northern Iraq, northern Syria has seen terrible devastation. And in Raqqa we have, in fast order, look at the terribly shelled Museum of Raqqa. Here are the people who are doing the work on the ground with our support. And by now the building is completed, but of course the restoration of the collections is ongoing in the hope that once again it will be a resource for the people of the region. In Afghanistan we've had many projects and many of them are still doing well, I'm happy to say. We of course immediately worked last year to again bring the collections in the Kabul Museum to safety, that we had been for months preparing for the possibility of the fall of Kabul. But here's a totally different project, the stupa of Shawaki, a Buddhist site. It's completed, the shoring up of it is completely completed. And I love this picture because it shows you just how many people it takes to do this work. Local people, different religions, different languages even, different communities, many skills gained in the process. Here's an example of work where you can see that we are just one of many players. Everybody has heard of the many libraries of manuscripts in Timbuktu and how many have been working at their preservation. There's always more that can be done. We're very focused on training, conservation training, and that project for the time being is completed as well. There are many others I could show you. Let me end with one that's of course on everyone's mind, because this is probably the greatest test of proof of concept that and actual efficacy that we have seen at ALIF, and that is the case of the war in Ukraine. What were ALIF's capabilities after the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine? I think the record here and the timeline really speak for themselves. We immediately approved. Again, our board is able to do this. We can move very quickly to set aside immediately an initial 2 million and another 1 million by April to help museums, to help cultural heritage sites, protect things. Again, we try to stay out of politics. We go where the need is to support the actual sites and the artifacts and the archives, to protect the monuments and sites, and to support the professionals on the ground who need our help and often do this work at great risk to themselves. And one great thing to note here is that we also were able to gain new access and have brought other partners into ALIF to support this work, so in terms of additional funds raised. So that's ALIF, and I'm just very delighted to be able to share this here because Kuwait has been such a key partner from the beginning. Last then, what is our responsibility? Why is it our responsibility to protect cultural heritage? ALIF is not the only new development in cultural heritage protection that gives us hope. Despite the constant threats to humanity's material record that we're seeing, there's new collective will to pull together organizations and people across borders and institutional types. I want to say we will never, of course, save every emanation of culture ever produced, nor would we want to. Not everything needs to be kept. We would be drowning in stuff if we did. What we do need to ensure, I think, is that the records of culture that matter to communities are not destroyed by deliberate acts of violence, by negligence, or by conditions of inequality. We need to ensure that those records of culture that matter to these communities can continue to inform the world about the life and the history of those communities which form part of our collective shared human heritage. And there's an even more painful reason to think about this, or pressing reason. When countries or sectarian groups commit intentional acts to obliterate cultural production, whether it's architecture or art or books or social rituals, the violence is rarely only about those objects or forms of performance. More often in history, these attacks are meant to hurt and erase the people right along with their heritage. That's what you see in some of these bombings too, in many different parts of the world. And this approach is not new to our age, frankly. I'm sorry to say that it was perfected in Europe. It was perfected in Nazi Germany, where relentless attacks on the cultural heritage and property rights of Jews preceded the death camps of the Holocaust by almost a decade. One could sort of see it coming, you could say. Politically motivated attacks on cultural heritage, in a funny way, prove the power of cultural heritage. Vibrant cultural heritage is a threat to forces that seek total domination over other groups and populations that are different from them. So if cultural heritage is a powerful force for good, it's for ethnic or religious cohesion, that can be a good thing. Its destruction, therefore, is analogous to the process of taking rights away from people. And we've seen that, I think, in many places where, in Egypt, for example, and Yemen, attacks by sects on cultural fabric are also intended to strike down people who take care of that heritage. Those people in Palmyra, for example, taking care of it, they were not themselves believers in those ancient rites, but they were in the way and they were taken away they were killed right along with the heritage. It can be very difficult to separate the intent to destroy heritage from the intent to kill people of a particular ethnicity or belief. And that linkage between attacks on communities and attacks on their heritage, on actual people, was very well understood by victims of the Nazi effort to eradicate Jews and Roma people. Raphael Lemkin, this interesting man, was a refugee from Poland, and he saw this connection very clearly. Lemkin, you may have heard of before, because he was a lawyer who emigrated to the United States after he escaped the Holocaust in Poland, and he coined the word genocide. He came up with it in 1944. He put a connection this way. He said, burning books is not the same as burning bodies. That one can agree on. But when one intervenes against the destruction of churches and books, one may arrive just in time to prevent the burning of bodies. The connection then between strategic attacks on heritage and systemic efforts to kill off human communities raises a responsibility in all of us and our governments to protect cultural heritage, even if we may not like all the heritage we see. And for this same reason of this connection between people and the heritage they're near, the protection of cultural heritage anywhere on earth cannot really succeed without a vigorous engagement and listening to the people who live with this heritage, who are closest to it, and who are most directly threatened by that proximity. From Baghdad to Basra, from Palmyra to Timbuktu, what we have learned is that those are also the people who are most likely to guard it for themselves, who care about it, even if it wasn't directly from their culture in the present. So by doing so, by stepping up and protecting culture in these extremely dangerous situations in their own countries and areas, these people are guarding that heritage for all humanity. And I think we can agree that we owe them our help and our gratitude. Thank you very much for listening to my story.